Dear beautiful soul, before anything else, the angels want you to know. You are loved, you are protected, and you are never ever alone. Heaven has been watching over you, walking beside you through every quiet night, every hard day, every moment when you wondered if anyone truly cared. And today, right now, in this very moment, your guardian angels are sending you a message so important, so deeply personal, that it will change the way you see everything that's been happening in your life. Stop what you are doing. Take a breath. Because what you are about to hear is not something that was meant for just anyone. This message found you for a reason. You were guided here, and by the time you reach the end of this message, your heart will understand why. Welcome to Angel's message for you. We are so glad you are here. Now let's begin. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the person who holds a piece of your heart, the one you think about even when you try not to, had an experience so intense, so powerful, so full of emotion last night that they woke up completely changed. Not changed by something bad, changed by something sacred, changed by something heaven itself allowed to happen. That is exactly what took place. And I, your guardian angel, could not let another moment pass without making sure you knew about it. Because what happened in the middle of last night was not ordinary. It was a turning point. It was a spiritual event designed to move things forward in your love story. And you deserve to know every detail. So stay with me, because what I am about to reveal is going to touch something deep inside you. Something you have been waiting to hear for a very long time. While you were resting, while your body was still and the world around you was quiet, the person your heart is connected to had a dream. Not just any dream, a dream that felt completely real. A dream permitted by heaven itself. A dream so vivid, so emotionally charged, that when they woke up, they were not the same person anymore. No, this was not about anyone else. There was no betrayal, no deception, no confusion. This was something pure, something sacred, something the universe allowed to happen because the time has come for things to shift between you. In that dream, you appeared, not as a faint memory, not as a blurry image fading at the edges. You appeared with perfect clarity. Your presence, your warmth, your energy, it was all there. And when this person felt you near, something inside them woke up. Something that had been waiting, quietly, patiently, for the right moment. In that sacred space inside the dream, time stopped. The past did not weigh anything. The future did not feel scary. There was only the two of you, in a place that felt safe and warm and full of peace. A space where love did not need to explain itself. Where it simply was true and undeniable. And in that space, your person looked at you differently. Not with confusion, not with hesitation, but with a look that only comes from the soul. A look that says, I know you, I have always known you, and I am done pretending otherwise. Tears came, words that had been locked away for too long. Words like, I have always loved you, even when I was confused, even when the distance felt impossible, even when I tried to walk away. I always knew, deep down, it was you. Those words were not made up by the dreaming mind. They came from somewhere real, somewhere honest, somewhere the soul goes when it is finally free to speak without fear. And they were spoken with trembling hands, with a chest full of emotion, with a kind of surrender that only happens when the heart stops fighting what it knows is true. And when this person woke up, they did not feel sadness. They did not feel regret. They felt something much more powerful. They felt certainty. They felt like something inside them had been set right, like a long crooked picture had finally been straightened on the wall. That glow, that quiet, unexplainable glow, stayed with them all day. a peaceful kind of brightness in the eyes, a smile that kept slipping out without warning, a stillness in the chest that felt like coming home. Anyone around them that day may have noticed something different without being able to name it. That is what happens when a soul touches something true. It shows, it radiates, and you need to hear this, beautiful soul, because I know there have been moments when you wondered if you were still remembered, if the feelings were still real, if time had quietly erased what once burned so bright. Today I am here to tell you, nothing has been erased. Nothing has faded. If anything, it has grown stronger in the quiet. The glow on their face was not just the afterglow of a dream. It was the physical reflection of a spiritual truth. The truth that what they feel for you is not a passing thought. It is not nostalgia. It is not wishful thinking. It is real. It is alive. And it has been alive this whole time, waiting for the right moment to step forward. Now let me tell you something that might surprise you. When you first hear about someone having such a powerful dream, such a joyful, emotional, intense experience, it is natural for the mind to start asking questions. What was it? Was this about someone else? Why was there so much joy? Why did it happen now? These are human questions. They are completely understandable. But as your angel, I am here to guide you to the higher truth. And the higher truth is this: there was no one else. What happened was a divine gift, a spiritual event orchestrated by heaven with a very clear and loving purpose. Your person did not choose to have that dream. They were chosen for it. Heaven reached through the barrier between the seen and the unseen, and it touched them. It woke something up inside them that had been sleeping under layers of fear, pride, self-protection, and doubt. The universe does this sometimes. When two souls are approaching a turning point, heaven steps in before the physical world catches up. It sends a preview, a reminder, preparation, says to the heart, do you remember? Do you feel this? Are you ready? And in that dream, your person's heart answered yes. With everything in them, yes. This was not a random event. It was a realignment, a repositioning of the soul. And it was allowed because you two are not just people who once had feelings for each other. You are connected by something that goes much deeper than circumstance. A bond that has outlasted distance, silence, confusion, and time. There is an invisible thread between you and this person. You have probably felt it. That strange pull that shows up without warning. The moment when a song comes on and suddenly they are in your mind. The quiet moments when you feel their presence even though they are nowhere near. The way their name surfaces in your thoughts for no logical reason. That is not coincidence. That is the thread. The spiritual connection between two souls who were woven together with purpose. And that thread does not snap just because life gets complicated. It does not dissolve just because time passes. It waits. It vibrates quietly. And when the time is right, it pulls. Right now, that thread is pulling hard. Both of you can feel it, even if neither of you has said it out loud. Your person feels it more clearly now than ever before, because the dream broke through walls that logic could not break. It reached places inside them that conversation and time had not yet touched. It dissolved fear. It dissolved resistance. It dissolved the old story they had been telling themselves about why this could not work. And that is the miracle hidden inside what happened last night. In that dream, there were words spoken that the universe needed your person to hear. Not from anyone outside, but from their own soul. The soul that carries your name. The soul that has been quietly, faithfully holding the truth about how much you mean to them. They said, I never stopped loving you, Even when I tried to convince myself it was over. Even when I looked for reasons to let go. There was always something pulling me back to you. Every time, without fail. They said, if I get another chance, I will do everything differently. I will protect what life almost took away. And in the most tender moment of all, they whispered, you are the only place where I feel whole. And no matter how much I tried to hide it, I have always known it was you. These were not performance words. They were not the kind of words the mind invents to feel better. They were soul-level confessions, the kind that rise only when every defense has been lowered, when there is nothing left to protect except the truth. And that truth is this: you have always been important. You have always been real to them. You have never been just an option, just a chapter, just someone they used to know. You have been presence. You have been home. You have been the one that keeps showing up inside their heart even when they did not invite you. And now, after that dream, they are no longer fighting it. There are feelings that survive everything. Feelings that outlast every attempt to bury them, replace them, or explain them away. And what this person feels for you is one of those feelings. It has been tested by time, tested by silence, tested by distance, and it is still standing. When they woke up from that dream, they did not rush to analyze it. They lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, breathing slowly. Something felt sacred about those first quiet minutes. They did not want to break the spell. They wanted to stay inside the warmth a little longer, inside the feeling of you. And then a soft smile came, then quiet tears, not tears of sadness, tears of relief, tears of recognition, the kind of tears that come when the heart finally stops arguing with itself and just accepts what it has always known. They thought of you throughout the day, not with longing that hurts, with longing that inspires, with the quiet knowing that something is moving, something is shifting, something that was stuck is finally starting to flow again. Beautiful soul, you need to receive this. Not just hear it, receive it. Let it land inside you like the truth it is. Because so often we carry doubt as if it protects us. We tell ourselves not to hope too much, not to feel too deeply, not to trust what the heart says because the heart has been wrong before. But sometimes the heart was not wrong. Sometimes the heart was simply early. Sometimes the love was always real. It just needed more time, more healing, more readiness before it could fully bloom. And that readiness has arrived. Your person is not the same as they were before that dream. They are more open, more present, more willing to let themselves feel without shutting down. The dream stripped away something that had been standing in the way. And now there is a clear, clean space where love can enter without having to fight for it. Heaven does not send experiences like this without reason. Every moment of what happened last night was designed. The setting in the dream, the emotions, the words, the surrender, all of it was orchestrated by something greater than either of you. The universe was saying, the time of preparation is ending. The time of fulfillment is beginning. And you are being included in this announcement. Because this message was not meant to simply inform you. It was meant to activate something in you. To shake loose whatever doubt has been keeping you from fully believing. To remind you that what you have always felt about this connection was not in your head. It was real. It is real. It has always been real. Now I want to speak directly to what might be happening inside you as you take all of this in. Because I know the heart does not always receive good news easily. When you have been waiting, when you have been hurting, when you have told yourself to let go and move on, hearing that something beautiful might be coming can feel almost terrifying. Feels too good to trust, too fragile to hold. I understand that. I see you completely, and I want you to know, The fear you feel is not a sign that this is not real. It is a sign that this matters to you deeply. And that is okay. That is human. That is sacred. But I need you to do something for yourself, beautiful soul. I need you to gently set down the armor. Just for now. Not because the world is suddenly safe. Not because hurt can no longer happen. But because love, the real soul-deep kind, cannot walk through a closed door. And your door has been partially closed. I see it. You have been protecting yourself. You have been holding just a little bit back. You have been afraid that if you fully believe and it does not happen, the fall will be too great. But here is what I want you to understand. The greatest risk is not in believing. The greatest risk is in closing yourself off to something that heaven itself is guiding toward you. Because this love is not coming back to repeat old patterns. It is not returning to bring more confusion or pain. It has been through something. It has been refined. And what is returning is truer, cleaner, more aligned with who both of you have become. So I am asking you to do something right now, in the quiet of your own heart. Say yes, not out loud if you do not want to, but from the inside. Say yes to the possibility. Say yes to the opening. Say yes to the idea that maybe, just maybe, heaven has been working on this even in the silence, even in the waiting, even in the moments when it felt like nothing was moving. Because everything was moving. You just could not see it yet. The invisible was doing its work. The spiritual was preparing the ground. And now the seeds that were planted in faith are beginning to push through. In the days ahead, you will feel signs. You may already be feeling them. A sudden strong thought of this person. A moment of unexpected emotion with no clear cause. A dream of your own. A song, a word, a small coincidence that feels like it carries a message. These are not accidents. These are confirmations. Little flares from heaven saying, we are still here. This is still real, stay open. Do not dismiss them. Do not talk yourself out of them. Let them speak to you. Let them remind you of the truth you heard today. Because the love that is approaching you now is not the love that left. It is the love that was always meant to arrive, just with more wisdom, more wholeness, more depth. Is a love that has been through something and survived. A love that knows its own name now. A love that is no longer afraid of itself. And you deserve every beautiful part of it. I want to share something with you that I witnessed from my place beside you. Something that your own eyes cannot see but your heart has always sensed. There is a bond between you and this person that was not built in this lifetime alone. It goes further back than memory. It lives in the soul-level place where recognition happens before the mind even has a chance to explain it. That is why the pull has been so strong. That is why walking away never worked. Not fully, not completely. That is why their name still does something to your chest even after all this time. Because you are not just two people who fell in love. You are two souls who made a promise somewhere much deeper than the surface of this world. And heaven is now moving to honor that promise. Not because life is supposed to be a fairy tale. Not because love is supposed to be easy, but because sometimes, when two hearts have done enough growing, enough healing, enough becoming, the universe says, it is time. Open the door. Walk toward each other. And that moment is now. You have been doing the inner work, even if you did not call it that. Every night you chose to keep your heart open instead of hardening it. That was inner work. Every time you chose hope over bitterness, that was inner work. Every time you allowed yourself to feel instead of shutting down, that was inner work. And it has not gone unnoticed. Heaven sees all of it. Your angels have witnessed every brave, quiet choice you made when no one else was watching. And your person has been doing their own work too. The dream was part of that, a necessary breaking open, a dissolving of the walls that fear had built, a sacred undoing of every barrier that stood between their heart and the truth. They walked into that dream carrying weight. They walked out of it lighter, more certain, more ready, changed at a level that even they may not fully be able to explain. But they feel it, and that feeling is not going away. Something has been set in motion, something that cannot be undone. And it is moving toward you right now, in the only way real love knows how to move, gently, surely, with deep and quiet conviction. So what do you do now, beautiful soul? What does heaven ask of you in this moment? First, breathe. Really breathe. Let this message settle into you like warmth. You do not need to figure everything out right now. You do not need to have a plan. You do not need to know exactly what to say or how to say it or when to take the next step. Just let yourself believe, even if just a little, even if just for this moment. Let yourself say, maybe this is real. Maybe I am worth this. Maybe love like this actually happens. Maybe heaven really did set this in motion. Maybe I do not have to keep carrying the weight of not knowing, because you do not have to carry that anymore. Second, stay present. In the coming days, stay in your heart. Stay tuned to the quiet signals. The universe will continue to speak. Signs will come in small ways, in timing that feels too perfect, in words that arrive at just the right moment, in a feeling of warmth that seems to come from nowhere. Honor those moments. They are real. They are messages. They are confirmation. And third, release what is no longer serving you. The old fears, the protective distance, the part of you that keeps rehearsing everything that went wrong so you do not have to risk hoping. Those things kept you safe when safety was what you needed. But they are not what you need anymore. What you need now is openness, courage, a willingness to meet what is coming with your whole self. Not just the guarded, armored part of you, but the real, raw, beautiful, full-hearted you. That is who this love is coming toward. That is the version of you that this person saw in the dream, open, present, radiant. That is who you truly are. And that is who heaven is calling forward right now. You are not too broken. You are not too late. You are not asking for too much. You are not dreaming too big. You are simply a soul in the middle of a story that is not finished yet. A story that heaven has not abandoned. A story that is right now, in this very moment, moving toward its most beautiful chapter. I have been with you through so much. I have held the prayers you were too tired to finish. I have walked beside you through the dark nights when you felt completely alone. I have carried hope for you when you could not carry it yourself. And now I get to be the one who tells you that the waiting is giving way to something new. Do not look away. Do not minimize this. Do not let the busy noise of your life drown out what you just received. This message came to you on purpose. It found you at the exact right moment, because this is the exact right moment. The love that is returning to you has crossed through the invisible to reach your awareness today. It knocked on the door of your heart through this message. And all you have to do is open it. Heaven is not asking you to be perfect. It is not asking you to have it all figured out. It is simply asking you to be willing, to be honest, to be open, to trust that when the universe goes to this much effort to send a message, it is not doing so for nothing. Something extraordinary is coming. You can feel it even now. Something in you recognizes the truth of these words, not because they are telling you something new, but because they are confirming something your heart has already quietly known. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of the part you have been waiting for. Beautiful soul, you are loved beyond what words can hold. You are seen completely. You are guided always. And you are walking towards something real, something sacred, something that was written for you before you even understood what love was. Keep going. Stay open. Keep your heart soft. And trust that every single thing that led you to this moment has been in service of something magnificent. Your guardian angel is with you. Heaven is with you. And love, real, soul-deep, destined love, is on its way. Receive it. You deserve it. And remember, you were never alone in any of this. Not for one single moment. Let me go a little deeper with you now, beautiful soul. Because there is more I want you to understand about what is happening between you and this person. More that I see from my place beside you that I believe will bring you real peace. You have wondered, haven't you? On the quiet nights especially. You have wondered if you were just holding on to something that was already gone. You have asked yourself, am I imagining this pull? Am I making up a connection that only lives inside me? Is it strange that I still think about this person, still feel them, still sense their presence even when they are nowhere around? No, beautiful soul, you are not making it up. You are not imagining it. You are feeling something that is absolutely real. A spiritual bond that has never once stopped vibrating, no matter how much surface-level silence surrounded it. And the dream that happened last night was proof of that. It was heaven's way of confirming what you have quietly known all along. That this is not just a memory. This is not just leftover feeling from something that ended. This is an ongoing, living connection that has been waiting for both of you to be ready enough to receive it fully. And that readiness, it is here now, on both sides. I want to talk to you about something that does not get discussed enough in spiritual messages. I want to talk about what it means to love from a healed place. Because that is what this moment is asking of you. Not just love, but love from wholeness. Love from strength. Love that is not born out of need or fear or desperation, but love that rises from your truest, most grounded self. So often, when we love someone deeply, we love them from our wounds. We love them from the part of us that is afraid of being alone, or the part that still carries old pain from past relationships and tries to make the new love fix it, or the part that believes love has to be earned, has to be proved, has to come with struggle before it can feel real. But that is not the love that is arriving now. What is coming toward you now is a different kind of love. Cleaner love. A love that does not require you to twist yourself into shapes to deserve it. A love that chooses you completely, freely, deliberately, not because you performed perfectly, but because the soul knows the soul. Because when two people are written together, no amount of time or distance or confusion can change what was decided at the soul level. And you have already done so much of the work to arrive at this place. More than you know. More than you may give yourself credit for. Think about who you were when this story began. Think about the fears you carried then. The patterns you could not even see. The wounds that ran so deep you did not even know they were shaping every choice you made. And then think about who you are now. What you have learned. What you have shed. The ways you have grown quieter and deeper and more honest with yourself. The ways you have stopped letting fear make all the decisions. That transformation is not nothing. That is everything. Because the version of you that exists today is the version this love is coming for. Not the younger, more defended version. Not the version that was still performing, still hiding, still pretending. The real you. The one who has been through enough to understand the difference between something that glitters and something that is gold. And what you have with this person It is gold. It always was. It just needed both of you to become people who could hold something that precious without dropping it. Heaven saw all of this. Heaven knew the timing. And heaven chose now, not before. Now, because now you are ready. Now they are ready. Now the energies can actually meet each other and build something that lasts. Something that was not possible before. Not because the love was not real, but because the ground was not yet prepared to receive it. The ground is prepared now. I want to tell you something about the spiritual energy that surrounds your connection right now. Something that I hope will make the hair on your arms stand up a little, because it is that real, that powerful. Right now, as you are receiving this message, there is an energetic shift happening between you and this person. Whether they are aware of it consciously or not, their soul is already reaching toward you, already opening, already making space. The dream broke something open in them. Not in a painful way, in a liberating way, like a window being pushed open to let in fresh air after a long winter. That freshness, that new openness, it is directed at you. The thoughts they are having today carry your name in them, even if they are not saying it out loud. The feelings moving through them right now are about you, about the possibility of you, about the hope that what they felt in the dream was not just a dream but a sign of what is coming. And it was. It absolutely was. So when you feel that pull in the coming days, that sudden warmth, that unexpected memory, that moment when something reminds you of them and your heart does something quiet and undeniable, pay attention to it. Do not brush it away. Do not tell yourself you are being foolish. That is the thread tightening. That is the universe saying, look here, feel this, trust this. Because things are moving, really moving, on the invisible level first, as they always do. The spiritual moves before the physical. The unseen clears the path before the seen can walk it. And right now, on that invisible level, so much is being rearranged in your favor. Trust that beautiful soul, even when you cannot see it. Even when the surface of your life looks unchanged. Even when you wonder if anything is actually happening. It is happening, just beneath the visible, just on the other side of the door you are about to open. And I want to speak to you now about fear, because I know it is there. Even as your heart is stirring with hope, there is a part of you that is quietly bracing. That is expecting something to go wrong. That is waiting for the other shoe to drop, because in your experience, things that feel this good often have a catch somewhere. I see that part of you. I honor it. It learned to protect you for good reason. It has kept you safe during times when safety was what you needed most. But beautiful soul, I need to ask you very gently and with all the love of heaven behind me, is that protection still serving you? Or has it become a wall that is keeping out exactly the thing your soul is most hungry for? Because love cannot climb a wall. Love can knock on a door. Love can send dreams and signs and messages and every kind of gentle nudge the universe knows how to deliver. But love cannot force its way through a heart that has decided to stay locked. And I absolutely know that you do not want to stay locked. I know you want to live this. I know that beneath all the caution and the careful distance and the practiced indifference, there is a version of you that is absolutely ready to believe that this love is real and coming and safe. There is a version of you that has never stopped wanting this, not really, not for one day. That version of you is right. And that version of you is the one heaven is speaking to right now. So let it hear this. You are safe to hope. You are safe to open. You are safe to lean into the possibility that what you have always felt about this connection was true, and that what is coming is actually good, actually beautiful, actually worth every moment of the journey that brought you here. Because it is. I promise you it is. And now I want to close with something I need you to carry forward from this moment. A kind of inner commitment, not to anyone else but to yourself. A promise you make in the quiet of your own heart, between you and the divine that loves you. Promise yourself that you will stop letting fear write your story. Promise yourself that you will choose to believe in the love that heaven is orchestrating on your behalf. Promise yourself that you will stay soft in the places where life tried to make you hard. That you will stay open in the places where pain tried to close you down. That you will stay hopeful even when hope feels like a risk. Because hope is not weakness. Hope is one of the bravest things a human heart can do. It takes real courage to keep believing that love is possible when you have known what it is to hurt. It takes real strength to stay open after being closed off felt so much safer. You have that courage. You have that strength. You have been showing it all along, even when you did not recognize it as strength. And the universe recognizes it. Your angels recognize it. And the person whose soul is reaching for yours right now, they recognize something in you too. Something that draws them, something that calls them, something that no amount of time or distance has ever been able to silence. You are loved, beautiful soul, truly, deeply, spiritually loved. Not just by the person whose name your heart carries tonight, but by the vast, luminous, endlessly compassionate universe that holds you in its hands even now. Stay open, stay trusting, stay in your heart. Everything that is meant for you is already on its way. With infinite love and divine protection, your guardian angels are always with you. There is one more thing I want to share with you, beautiful soul. One more layer of what heaven is asking you to receive today. Throughout your life, you have had moments, brief, quiet moments, where you felt something brush past the edges of your awareness. Like the feeling that you were being watched over. Like the sense that even in the hardest situations, something was guiding you. Like the whisper in the back of your mind that said, hold on, something good is coming, just hold on a little longer. That was not your imagination. That was real. That was us, your angels, the universe, the great love that surrounds this world, speaking to you in the softest possible way. Not wanting to overwhelm you, not wanting to interfere with your free will, just gently, persistently reminding you that you are not forgotten, that you are not walking this path alone, that every single thing you have been through has been witnessed and held with care. And the same is true right now, in this moment, in the circumstances of your love story, in the waiting and the wondering and the hoping. Every bit of it has been held. Every prayer you sent out, even the ones you were not sure anyone could hear, every one of them landed. Every one of them was received. And the answer to all of them is beginning to take shape. Not in the way fear would predict. Not in a guarded, careful, barely there kind of way. In a full, real, beautiful, alive kind of way. The kind of way that changes things permanently. Heaven is generous, beautiful soul. When it moves with abundance. When it opens a door, it opens it wide. And the door that is opening for you right now, the one that leads to the love your heart has always known was possible, it is opening all the way. So walk toward it, with your whole self, with your heart out in front. With every beautiful scar and every hard-won wisdom and every soft piece of you that survived all the storms. Walk toward it exactly as you are, because you are enough. You have always been enough. And the love that is coming for you knows that. It does not need you to be perfect. It needs you to be present. It needs you to be willing. It needs you to say, yes, I am here, I am open, I am ready to receive this, and then to mean it. And when you do, beautiful soul, when you finally step fully into that open space, you will understand why everything had to happen the way it did. You will look back at the delays, the detours, the painful pauses, and you will see the beauty hidden inside each one. You will see that nothing was wasted, that everything was preparation, that the love you are about to live is deeper and richer and more real because of every single thing that came before it. Heaven does not waste a single moment of your story. Not one. Every chapter, even the painful ones, especially the painful ones, has been part of building you into the person who is ready to hold this love and keep it sacred. And you are that person now. So go forward with faith, beautiful soul. Go forward knowing that you are loved from every direction, by the angels who walk beside you, by the universe that holds your name with care, and by the person whose soul found yours in the dream space of last night and woke up changed. Everything is already in motion. Everything is already being prepared. And everything that is meant for you is heading home to you right now. Receive it with joy. Receive it with grace. Receive it with the fullness of a heart that has waited long enough and finally knows. The love was always real, the timing was always right, and you were always worth it. With all the love and light of heaven. Amen.